Hello, Simon.
Hi, Maria. Good morning.
Good morning. It feels like a privilege to be talking to you on this big stage, and I've been a huge fan of your work. And for everyone who wants to start an incredible journey of learning country promotion or nation brand, I would recommend to start with Simon's work and books. And we will talk about that a bit later. But you know, we are here in Kiev in a big conference hall, and it reminded me of the conversation you once had with our team before the invasion. We talked then about Ukraine's central idea or what Ukraine's image should be about. And now we are in 2024, on the third year of Russian full-scale invasion. So let's start from the beginning, right? What's your reflection or ideas of what happened in 2022 in terms of Ukraine image and brand? And yeah, please share your thoughts with us.
Well, thank you, Maria. I think what Marco Ferraro said about Ukraine becoming a new nation on the global map, the rising of an Atlantis, was a really interesting way of putting it. And I guess that's the reality. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia effectively brought Ukraine to public attention for the second time in recent history, but in a much, much bigger way. So we'll talk later about the different shades of perception that different groups of people have about Ukraine, some positive, some negative. But just in terms of the overall awareness of this country, it shot up. And what we do with that awareness is really the big question. So in one sense, it's a very tragic way of becoming noticed. Dozens of countries all around the world want to be noticed. They want to be known. And it's happened to Ukraine in a very big way, for the worst possible reasons, but it's happened. And so we can call that soft power, we can call it awareness, we can call it whatever we like, but it's there. And now the question is, what do you do with this?
That's a very good question. And you know, very often when I talk about this shift in Ukraine's familiarity and awareness, we talk about publicity which we never wanted, and you're right that we paid the highest possible price for it. We're talking about current times, and now we've had a talk before this dialogue on stage with Simon online, and you said that you have the latest data from the recent Nation Brands Index, which you would like to share with us and talk about positive sides, but also challenges that Ukraine faces on the global arena.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to be sober and realistic and to base all of our assumptions on good, hard data. People's opinions about the images of countries are often incorrect. My own are always incorrect. If anybody ever asks me my opinion about how country A perceives country B and I make a guess, my guess is always wrong. So data is tremendously important. And the Nation Brands Index is the tool that I use to try to understand these things better. It's a big international survey which I've been running now for nearly 20 years. We launched it in 2005. We've been measuring the image of Ukraine since 2014 and the image of Russia for considerably longer, and a large number of other countries as well. And what we do is we interview about 40,000 people in 20 or 30 countries around the world every year, and we submit a very detailed questionnaire about their perceptions of all kinds of aspects of these various countries. And when we're looking at what's happened to the images of Ukraine and also the image of Russia, I don't want to spend too long on the image of Russia, but it's important to note those two phenomena and how they interact with each other. The story is not a particularly happy one. What we find is that ever since the invasion, Russia's image has dropped catastrophically. This we would expect. One of the things we found from the Nation Brands Index over the years is that public opinion internationally does not tolerate conflict. They just don't like it. And in a way, they dislike it so much that they have a tendency to punish all of the countries that are involved in conflict. So it's not a simple matter that the image of the aggressor goes down and the image of the victim goes up. What we tend to see is that the images of all the countries involved go down. They get suppressed by the fact of conflict. And this is a great tragedy for the victims, because it means not only are they being punished in a real physical sense, but also in a sense their image is being damaged as a result of no fault of their own, but because they're involved with conflict, and international public opinion doesn't like to think of conflict. We all want to live in a peaceful world, and when it doesn't happen, that affects our perceptions of the countries that are involved. So what happened to Ukraine's image? That after the Russian invasion, Ukraine's image stopped growing. It's just basically flattened out. Like every other country we've ever measured, Ukraine's image was gradually improving every year. This is one of the fascinating things about the survey. We discover that year on year, the normal, natural process is for the images of all countries to improve. Russia, by the way, is the only exception. It's the only country whose image has not improved since 2008, when we started measuring this particular phenomenon. But Ukraine's, like every other country, was gradually rising. Year by year, everybody on the planet likes all other countries a little bit more. And I think that's probably the result of globalization. We become more and more accustomed to the idea that we share the planet with other countries. And as we get more accustomed to that, we tolerate them more and we gradually like them more. But Ukraine's has stopped growing, it's flattened. And if we break that down into the countries where these perceptions are happening, we'll see that the world is splitting along predictable lines.
Yes.
So the reason why Ukraine's image has stopped growing is because we've got a number of countries who quite clearly, from the data, take the Russian side. Their opinions are firmly against Ukraine and for Russia. That includes Russia itself, of course. That's the country where the civilian population is most negative towards Ukraine and most positive towards Russia. This is normal and we would expect it. China, the balance of the population is somewhat in favor of Russia and somewhat against Ukraine. This is a result of the propaganda that they receive from their own government. India, the majority of the population, a small majority, is in favor of Russia and against Ukraine. Saudi Arabia, it's around about equal. So we have approximately equal numbers of Saudi Arabians for Ukraine and for Russia. Sometimes this is partly cultural. There are some cultures, anthropologically speaking, where irrespective of the rights and wrongs of the situation, they admire strong countries with strong leaders. And if that strength is expressed through violence, that doesn't mean that they necessarily disapprove of it. They sometimes like that. And then we get to countries like, for example, Mexico and Turkey, where it's more or less balanced between pro-Ukraine and pro-Russia. And then all the rest of the countries that we measure, it's the people who approve of Ukraine are in a majority. Right the way down to our friends in Poland, who show the biggest majority in favor of Ukraine and the smallest minority in favor of Russia. So it's a very split picture. And we have to be thinking all the time about the great divide in the world. And it's not just in Russia and Ukraine, it's on many, many topics. The world, we can see from the Nation Brands Index, is splitting between what we might call the BRICS Plus nations and the G7 nations. And this, I think, is, if anything, an even bigger challenge than the immediate challenge of the conflict in Ukraine today. The world is splitting in half. And Ukraine is in the most fantastic, advantageous position to try to begin to mend that split. This is much more than just defending Ukraine against aggression. This is about defending the world against splitting in two.
Yes, indeed. And I understand that there probably are no universal advice, but what would you advise for, and we have here in the audience experts working with Ukraine's promotion and external communications in governments and civil society, what Ukraine should do to make this split less obvious and to win hearts and minds of people not only in the allied countries, but also globally? You mentioned Saudi Arabia, Africa, China, Latin America. What would you advise to focus on?
I know this is very difficult advice to follow. But if it's at all possible, occasionally, sometimes not to think about winning this battle, but about making it the last battle. So in other words, not about necessarily winning 7 days of the week, but maybe 1 day of the week thinking about ending this kind of conflict, reaching out, building bridges. So not trying to, it's not about necessarily Ukraine trying to push apart the pro-Ukraine countries and the anti-Ukraine countries, but to bring them all together into a common understanding of the common challenges that humanity is facing today. And that ultimately is the way in which Ukraine is going to improve and increase its soft power, not by fighting its own side, but by fighting for the whole of humanity. Not by fighting for the West, but by fighting for everybody. The aim, the ambition could not be higher than that. It has to be about making sure that this is the last conflict, that this is not the beginning of a terminal split between the two halves of the world, but the beginning of a global realization that this is not the way to be going. This is not the way that we want the rest of human society to be. So whenever Ukraine reaches out to help other countries, even in the moment of its most extreme need, that is the most touching, the most powerful, the most effective thing it can do. Everybody expects Ukraine to be defending itself. Everybody expects Ukraine to be looking after its own interests. Nothing could be more natural. But what would really astonish and surprise people and touch their hearts is if Ukraine, in this awful moment in its history, is actually thinking of others too. This almost Gandhi-like behavior is what changes minds. Everything else is simply reinforcing existing perceptions.
We've discussed with you that what makes a good country, and you're also a known author of the book called Good Country, which all of our delegates will get a free copy after this conference with kind donation from Simon. So what, in your mind, what is a good country, and how is Ukraine a good country, and how a country can become a good one?
A good country is a country that thinks about other countries as well as its own. It's as simple as that. What I call the gold standard of good governance in the 21st century is countries and governments that are able to harmonize their domestic needs with the needs of other countries and other parts of the planet. It's as simple as that, because as I said before, we live in an age of gigantic global challenges, conflict, of course, but also climate change, migration, poverty, inequality, pandemics, and all the rest of it. And so if countries don't collaborate together, but all countries, not just groups of countries, then in the longer term, we really are in big, big trouble. So a good country is a country that understands this and is committed to harmonizing its domestic good governance with international good governance. And this is what Ukraine needs to do as much of as it possibly can. And a lot of people, when they hear me say that, they say, but we've got so many problems at home. We have to focus on those. The idea that we could start somehow helping other countries as well is insane. And that's because they believe that those two things are somehow contrary to each other. That you can't help your own population without ignoring the rest of the world. You can't help the rest of the world without ignoring your own population. It's just not true. And over the last 25 years, I've been advising governments all over the world and trying to encourage them to create this harmony between domestic and international. And one of the things we discover is that they make better policy when they do it. When you're thinking internationally, you produce better domestic policy. When you're producing better domestic policy and you're thinking international, it produces better international policy. So this is a trick that all countries and all governments need to learn. It's an amazing trick. It makes your governance better. Now, the reason why this is so important as part of the conversation in this context of soft power is because there is a very, very strong correlation between the countries that are good and the countries that have good images. The countries we admire are the countries that do the most good in the world. They're not the most successful countries. Why is it that everybody in the world admires Norway, for example? It's not primarily because Norway is a well-governed country. It's not primarily because Norwegian people have more money or that their landscape is more beautiful. It's because people perceive Norway as a friend to the international community. They've heard of the Oslo Peace Accords, and they know that Oslo is in Norway. So the countries that people admire, the ones with the best images, are the ones that do the most work for the world. And that's why Ukraine, just like any other country, if it wants to raise its profile and it wants to improve its image, it's not a question of bragging about its successes and its achievements. It's a question of demonstrating through daily actions that it is a friend to the rest of the world, to the international community. And that's what generates a good image.
It's quite natural to be self-focused, especially for the countries that undergo such situations as Ukraine, full-scale invasion. But it is indeed an answer to how become a good country, how become globally relevant, and probably how to fill this split which you talked about between the Western world and the so-called global south, which I know is a term not very often used nowadays, but indeed. And let's talk about the future and the vision for Ukraine's brands, and this discussions about central ideas or associations or the projected image which the country should have or will have. We all understand that currently Ukraine is associated with the war. That's like 80% of global population knows that A, there is a country like Ukraine, and B, there is a war there. What if we talk about 5, 10, 15 years perspective, if we talk about post-war recovery and what we want the world to know about Ukraine and the world to associate with Ukraine, so we can attract very typical country promotion things, tourism, global talents, investments. What would be your advice or your vision? What brands Ukraine should win for victory and for post-war recovery?
Well, Maria, the answer is so simple, and it's probably too simple to be a very satisfactory answer. But whenever people ask me this question about any country, what should be the aim? What do we want people to think? It's always the same. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I hope sooner than that, somebody somewhere, a random person in another part of the world, in the last 30 seconds before they drift off to sleep, is thinking to themselves, thank God Ukraine exists. That's the mark of success. Now, if one person thinks that, that's one. If 7 billion people think that, that's 100% success. So somewhere between one random person in one random country and everybody on the planet thinking, thank God Ukraine exists, that's the mark of success. Now, the particular way in which Ukraine earns this privilege remains to be seen. It's a question, it's not about sectors, it's not saying it's going to be alternative energy, it's going to be this or that. It's going to be all kinds of things. What nation branding, I don't like the term at all, it's a very confusing term, but what it means, if it means anything at all, is not telling people how wonderful you are. It's about the things that you do. Ultimately, countries are judged by the things that they do, not by the things that they say about themselves. And so if a country wants to improve its image, it has to project a constant stream of dramatic evidence that it deserves the reputation it desires. So communications are tremendously important. Strategic communications are a tremendously important weapon in the war for hearts and minds. So all of that is very important. But what are those words describing? What are they referring to? If they're just talking about ideas, then they're empty words. They have to be words that are talking about real things that Ukraine is doing in the real world. So let's never forget, we have to start with reality. We have to start with deeds and behaviors. What is Ukraine actually doing? And then the communications sort themselves out. That's about making sure people know. But if we find ourselves starting with the words and starting with the images and starting with the communications, then probably that's going to have very little impact.
That's really good advice, to start with deeds, not the words. And we talked today a lot about do's, but we didn't talk about don'ts. So what would you advise us, or any other country globally, not to do when it comes to countries' brand reputation and image?
Well, I think maybe don't use the word brand too often. It is in some ways quite a dangerous word, partly because it doesn't have a single common definition. And it's a very confusing word, because sometimes when people say brand, they're actually talking about a logo or a visual identity. Sometimes they're talking about image or reputation in the minds of other audiences around the world. Sometimes they're talking about shared purpose. And frankly, if you've got a word that people are using all the time in 3 different ways, then your meetings are basically sabotaged from the very start. You think you're agreeing and you're not, because you're talking about different things. So I think it's really important to use really simple language and avoid all of this marketing jargon. We're talking about the things we do and the things that we say. And probably the wisest expression I think I've ever heard is the expression, the diplomacy of deeds. I think this phrase was originally invented by Dwight Eisenhower, but Condoleezza Rice later on started using it, and it's become associated with her, but it doesn't matter who invented it. It's genius. The diplomacy of deeds means the impact that your actions have on people's perceptions. And that's the true art of public diplomacy, and it's also the true art of nation branding, if such a thing exists. So don't have conversations purely about ideas. Don't have meetings purely about branding. Don't open your mouth unless you've got something to say. So communicating when you don't know what it is you're actually saying, when it's just ideas, that's the biggest don't of all, I think. And also, this may sound like an inappropriate thing to say in this context, but don't spend too much money on it. If you find that you're needing to spend millions and millions of euros or tens of millions of euros on communication campaigns, it's fine if it's for tourism promotion. It's fine if you're selling a product or a service. But if it's to try and change people's perceptions, then the fact that you need to spend all that money is probably an indication that you're trying to force people to believe something they don't want to believe. If you're saying things that are really relevant to people's lives, then they will listen, and you shouldn't have to spend too much money. We're lucky enough to live in the age of social media. I know it's a terrible curse, but it's also a great blessing, because it means that it can make marketing free. If you're saying things, and you're doing things, more importantly, that are genuinely relevant and genuinely inspiring and interesting to other people around the world, then social media will do your marketing for you. You should not have to spend a huge amount of money on doing that.
Indeed, I think Ukraine is an expert in doing communications for free, given the situation and the many people off in the audience. Thank you for advice. Also, it's a tough one for Brands Ukraine team at Brands Ukraine International Conference to use brand less, but we will try. I am not sure how much time do we have, and I'm looking now at the technical team, but probably
5 minutes is
5 minutes, perfectly. I would open a floor to questions from our audience. I think we will have, Simon, if you have 5 minutes, and I know we've been late with our dialogue, to take 1 or 2 questions from our audience. Yeah. Please raise your hands, and I will ask for technical assistance. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello. My name is Fatima Tamarova. I'm the head of the Ukrainian Committee for Protection of Human Rights. And we were talking about the negative effects. And it's also very true to say that there is some positive image of Ukraine in the world, but Russian aggression and Russian disinformation is playing a crucial role in making negative effect, and also it is effects with our policy with our neighbors like Poland, Hungary, and other. It's interesting to look at the methodology, like how different events, how different actors they affect on the good, positive image of Ukraine, and what do you think about this? How to do something to make to overcome the negative effect. And also it is interesting to make research on public opinion in different countries, because also I was as a refugee in UK, I saw the different people and different public audience, they perceive Ukraine in different way. And also there are so many Russian narratives. They want to destroy the good, positive image of Ukrainian people that are coming. Some are, you know, all these different myths, like people are coming to take European Union money and other things, and how to combat with this. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. It's a really important question. A couple of things I'd like to say. First of all, I mentioned a moment ago that there are good things and bad things about social media. The worst thing about social media is the fact that so many of those platforms, algorithms are driven by conflict. They're driven by moral outrage, they're driven by anger, and they're driven by the attention that comes from negative emotions. And the consequence of this is that it has the effect of polarizing public opinion. It clears the middle ground. It makes it impossible for anybody to have a nuanced or intelligent or informed view of anything, because the whole of any population is shoved either to the extreme left or to the extreme right. And this teaches humanity a very, very bad lesson, that of the binary, idiotic simplification of very complex topics. You're either for Ukraine or against Russia. You're either for this or for that, or against this or against that. And this is very, very dangerous, because the only way that we can progress, the only way that civilization can survive, is if we have nuanced, balanced discussions and people are prepared to listen and prepared to change their minds. And it's very important that Ukraine should demonstrate this and show leadership in this area. Having said that, what you have to just be patient and hope that your constant stream of strategically informed, consistent, positive actions will eventually win the day. Somehow or other, despite the disinformation, people will eventually get the message and start to trust. Now, the great advantage that Ukraine has in the battle for hearts and minds, in the war of information against Russia, is that Ukraine doesn't have a negative image in most of the countries we're looking at. It has a weak image, and that is a disadvantage, but it's not catastrophic. Russia, on the other hand, in the vast majority of countries where we measure it, has a very strongly negative image. And there's a big difference between those. If you have a negative image, it doesn't matter what you do, people will interpret everything you say and do in a negative way. And the problem for Russia is not that people don't like them, it's that people don't want to like them. So even if tomorrow everything suddenly turned upside down and the Russians started behaving nicely, people still wouldn't like them, because they would interpret all of that nice behavior in some negative way. Ukraine doesn't have this problem because it doesn't have a negative image. So even though the Russians are trying very hard to discredit everything that you do, the general populations are not. They are not assuming that anything good that you do is something you're doing for the wrong reasons. So you have some grace, you have some space, some breathing space to do good things and for those good things to be interpreted. The disinformation is a problem and you have to keep tackling it. That's a separate issue. It's a technical issue as much as anything else. Again, to echo the comments that Marco Ferrari made earlier, building communities, that is your strength. What Russia is trying to do to Ukraine is trying to isolate it in public opinion. This is one of Russia's standard tricks. If they succeed, you are lost. And that's why building connections with as many groups in as many parts of the world as you possibly can is the source of your strength. It's the same thing that makes the internet so robust. If a tyrant or a dictator tries to bring down the internet, they'll find it very difficult because it's connected in so many millions of places with so many millions of people, and it makes it fail safe. The same metaphor could be applied to Ukraine. You are safer if you're more connected. And the more groups that you deal with, the more friends you have. Marco mentioned academic communities, development communities, and particularly communities beyond your European neighborhood in all parts of the world. The better you're connected, the safer you are.
Thank you, Simon. One more question. I can see your hands. The last one, yes.
Hi, my name is Dmitro. I'm working with influencers and creators globally. And my question to you actually is a little bit practical one. What is your source of the energy to consistently support Ukraine? Because what I face quite often, that people are a bit tired of supporting Ukraine, a bit tired of talking about Ukraine. So share please your secret recipe for us to use it for all those who are already tired.
Thanks, Mitro. It's a great question. I think it's got a lot to do with constantly, I talked about a constant stream of dramatic evidence that Ukraine deserves the reputation it desires. And another word for dramatic evidence is creativity. Now, creativity is another difficult word, of course, and people mean many different things by it. For me, it's very simple. Creative is the opposite of boring, right? And part of the reason, let's be frank about it, why we get this sort of fatigue in general populations is because they have a very short attention span. We all do, and we get bored of the same message pretty quickly. And so the more energy you can put into creativity, not being boring, doing stuff that's magical, fascinating, unique, and above all relevant to the audiences around there, the more effectively you will fight against that fatigue. And really the big change, or the big ambition that I was talking about right at the start, where Ukraine starts to earn the position of being a builder of bridges, something that's a country that's not just a problem in the world, but is a solution for the wider world. That, more than anything else, is what will start to recapture the energy and the attention and the love of people around the world, because they'll start to feel, they'll stop feeling sorry for Ukraine, and they'll start feeling grateful to Ukraine. And that's the biggest change you can possibly have. In the end, people can only feel sorry for somebody else for a limited period. I don't mean to sound cynical, but we are fundamentally self-interested creatures. People are really, in the end, much more interested in their own country and their own lives. That's just natural. It's biological. It's evolutionary. It's the way we are. But people do have great stores of love and energy and affection in their being for people that they feel glad of, for people that they feel grateful to. And the same applies to countries. So the reason why people will not just appreciate or respect Ukraine, but the reason why people will love Ukraine, and from love comes constant energy, is when they feel grateful that Ukraine exists because of what Ukraine is doing for the planet. And the argument that's been used up until now, particularly by the European institutions and by NATO, you're not just in supporting Ukraine, you're not just supporting Ukraine, you're supporting the free world, the West, and all the rest of it. That's fine, but it's still fundamentally quite a negative message. You're trying to motivate people by frightening them. And sometimes that has a role, but in the end, being attracted is a much more powerful stimulant than being repelled. And fear repels people. It's the same story with climate change. When you do what, for example, Al Gore started out by doing when he first started talking about climate change, he was basically like an Old Testament prophet, prophesying floods and famine and tribulation. And in the end, adults don't want to hear about that. They're like children. They cover their ears and they say, no, 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 I don't want to hear that. In the end, if you want to motivate people, you have to fill them with desire for a better future for everybody. And that's the motivating message, and that's the motivating behavior from Ukraine. You have to drive people mad with desire for a better world for everybody, a world without conflict, and not, as I said before, just about winning this battle, but by making it the last battle.
Thank you. That was a perfect question and a perfect answer to finalize our dialogue. And I will keep my last question to myself for the next dialogue, which I will hope we will have in person in Kiev next year. Simon, thank you so much for being here with us today. And I hope it was really insightful and useful conversation for all of you. So a round of applause for Simon, please.
And a round of applause for you.
Thank you.